Thank all of you for joining us in our ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari with the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective. This has been going on forever and ever and ever, and as always, I thank all of you for joining. If you want to find us on Twitter, you can find us at D&GQC. On Patreon, DGQC, if you have the desire at all to support what we're doing, every dollar helps, as always. We're today moving into Psychoanalysis and Ethnology, which is 3.4 or 166. I am unable to stream in here, which is interesting. This section is a little bit more of a drier one as far as things go. And I don't mean dry as in boring. I mean, there's a lot less of the poetry in this. This is a hard discussion about ethnology. If any of you have a background in such a thing, it's incredibly useful here. The last time we went through this, and as always, I try to have a handful of people on the server who this is basically their majors and their masters, and for one or two, their doctorate hits inside of this world. That is not the case for me. So this is going to be a bit more of a reading and discussion and light, and we'll get through it. If you have any questions at any time, just raise your hand and we'll get you on stage, and that'll be how that's set up. Pretty simple. We'll see how this goes. So I'll go ahead and dive into psychoanalysis and ethnology. We're moving too fast, acting as if Oedipus were already installed within the savage territorial machine. However, as Nietzsche says with regard to bad conscience, such a plant does not grow on that kind of terrain. This is explained by the fact that the necessary conditions for Oedipus as a familial complex, existing in the framework of the familialism suited to psychiatry and psychoanalysis, are obviously not present. Primitive families constitute a praxis, a politics, a strategy of alliances and filiations. Normally, they are the driving elements of a social reproduction. They have nothing to do with an expressive microcosm. In these families, the father, the mother, and the sister always also function as something other than father, mother, sister. And in addition to the father, the mother, etc., there is the affine, who constitutes the active, concrete reality. There's the affine, who constitutes the active, concrete reality and makes the relations between families coextensive with the social field. It would not even be exact to say that the family determinations burst apart at every corner of this field and remain attached to strictly social dimensions, since both kinds of determinations form one and the same component in the territorial machine. Since familial reproduction is not yet a simple means or a material at the service of a social reproduction of another nature, there is no possibility of reducing social reproduction to familial reproduction, nor is it possible to establish one-to-one relations between the two that would confer on any familial complex, whatever an expressive value and an apparent autonomous form. On the contrary, it is evident that the individual in the family, however young, directly invests a social, historical, economic, and political field that is not reducible to any mental structure or affective constellation. That is why, when one considers pathological cases and processes of cure in primitive societies, it seems to us entirely insufficient to compare them with psychoanalytic procedure by relating them to criteria borrowed from the latter. For example, a familial complex, even if it differs from our own, or cultural material, even if it is brought into relation with an ethnic unconscious, as seen in attempted parallelisms between the psychoanalytic cure and the shamanistic cure, Devroe and Levi-Strauss. Our definition of schizoanalysis focused on two aspects: the destruction of the expressive pseudo forms of the unconscious, and the discovery of desire's unconscious investments of the social field. It is from this point of view that we must consider many primitive cures. They are schizoanalysis in action. Yeah, there's a lot said quickly up front here. The opening here is to have the discussion, as we just went through, continuing with Oedipus, having the discussion around Oedipus, talking through Oedipus, the discussion around how it forms, why it forms, when it forms. Look, so here's the thing. As I started reading this, like, there's like 6 of us in the room. I was excited to do the stage thing because last week we had 27, and that became just unwieldy for us to ask questions. For 4 people or 7 people, feel bad. Where's Kanye? JK's coming in. Sorry about that, JK. Sorry, everyone. We'll get this in the right spot. It's dictating the story of this without being able to have an open conversation doesn't really work. If we have 25 people in here, it's different, but we don't this week. It's got really awkward. Look, does anyone here have a question on this paragraph? Because this is a really easy one. Like as far as like...
I feel like I just need one little link to the expressive pseudo forms. I feel like we've talked about this before, but I forgot, I think. Expressive pseudo forms of the unconscious. So the destruction of the expressive pseudo forms. And what is expressive pseudo forms again? Is it like the paralogism of the subject?
It's all the paralogisms, essentially, if you think of them as, to me, how I understand them is we're talking about the pseudo forms of the unconscious. One of those pseudo forms is the id, ego, superego, or the Oedipus, or the Oedipal complex, or whatever complex you've got. One of the great challenges when you start looking back and doing an ethnological study of people, which is what this is about. This is about us, how we take ideas that we have and we look back and we basically are utilizing our preconceived understanding in order to create the rules that society operates in. We're doing that with these expressive pseudo forms of the unconscious, where, like he outright says, the parallelisms between psychoanalytic cure and the shamanistic cure, like Levi Strauss or Devereux basically straight out said, this thing that they're doing is identical to the thing that we do now. Here's how they're the same, and drawing the lines, because the materials, and again, they talked about this, the materials can be identical, like, and they will be very often. I mean, there's only so many combinations of things that can exist in the world or in thought, like stuff runs out, but it doesn't mean that they're underlying the same or that the unconscious operates the same. Again, to them, it's about pulling back and actually getting to the idea of what desires unconscious investments are within the social field. That's the first thing that we need to do. And to do this, we need to first go back to all the primitive cures and talk about how they actually operate truly within the actual unfettered flows of desire.
Right, and when we talk about investments in that sense, they're referring to the machinic working of the desire, in the sense that it's constantly trying to look for those connections?
Yes.
Like is that what the investment is?
Correct. Yeah, the discovery of desire's unconscious investments of the social field is how do we get invested in that? And this is going to be getting into that, because desire machines don't connect to the social field directly. But how does desire become involved in the social field? How does it push into that? How do we deal with that? And how does this happen? In order to go back, it's the old, there's an old video I really liked. One of those like science YouTubers did, and I think he missed the point of the thing, but I really liked, he went around and he asked people, said, all right, I'm going to say a series of numbers, and I have a rule in mind that makes those numbers what they are. You're going to say some numbers back to me, and I will tell you whether or not it fits my rule, and you have to guess the rule. Very simple game. I've played it with my son. And he goes, okay, 2, 4, 8. And everyone goes, oh, 4, 6, 12. And he's like, yes, that follows. And they go, oh, well, you're doubling every time. And he's like, no, that's not the rule. But what happens when the second step happens and people start setting it up, they actually keep guessing like 10, 20, 40, or whatever it is. They can never actually create something inside of the way that they ask, or the series of numbers that challenges their own assumption. It's a very fascinating psychological phenomenon that happens. And here is what they're talking about. It's the same thing. When we look back and we have in our head our assumption that we operate with the Oedipus complex, or we operate with an ego, a superego, or whatever, this is so cliched in our understanding of our own reality. This is the pseudo form of the unconscious we assume we have, that we're unable to look back and assign anything else to anyone, because that's the way it works. Like, of course it's going to work that way. That's the way it works, is kind of this weird tautological reality. And so it's a lot of their stuff here. They're like, look, primitive families constitute a praxis, a politics, a strategy of alliances and affiliations. they're not a family the way that we describe a family today. If I say, oh, my family, like, yes, there is some level where we have our alliances, affiliations, and a political and a praxis, and we're doing stuff to a point. But the nuclear family is so atomized and alienated inside of capital that my existence with my wife and son, we're more a family unit. And it's a kind of a family. Like I don't know that it's not the same thing as the way that families existed inside of the primitive as they're describing it here. If this ramble makes any sense.
Yeah, I not necessarily a question, but I noticed something, and I think I wondered if you maybe could tell something about it. I noticed how they say processes of cure and not necessarily processes of curing, and they seem to always um, seems in text that they emphasize the term of cure. Do they have like a is it just the normal way we understand what cure is, or does that relate to something else that they maybe refer to?
So I don't know necessarily specifically their wording here. I can tell you what how the chapter runs is they're going to be getting into we have complexes, we try to fix people. What do we do as a society now to get people to be fixed? And I put that in quotes. I don't really like that term, but it's really what we're talking about. Like a society bends people to make them fixed. That's what they do. So in societies of old, like they didn't have psychoanalysts, they didn't have Adderall or psychotropic drugs or whatever. How did they fix people? And I'm putting that in quotes. And that's what they're talking about when they say cure here. Like how
So
did to me that's what
also
they're saying.
assuming that there was a problem in the first place.
Say again.
Um, so also assuming that there's a problem in the first place,
Yeah,
which is probably from the Oedipus complex.
yeah, it's um I don't know if necessarily, and again I don't have the original language in front of me, so like it may be that they say curing or cure or there's another word, or they may be using, and this is my assumption is this comes from Guattari because he uses this word a lot from his time inside of the psychoanalytic or asylum space. The processes of cure, the methods that they use for treatment. Treatment could be another name. But this chapter is going to outline a really interesting thing that they're going through, which is how do we, I'm not going to say necessarily that anything's wrong or whatever, but to live in a society, we need some level of repression. I have a 3-year-old. One of the toughest parts about a 3-year-old is knowing when to actually say no. Because there is stuff like I don't want him to hit the dog as a thing that happened when he was like 1.5, because kids have no idea how anything works. Or jumping and falling on top of daddy when he should. Like, what is a no? How do you, and that's repression. But, there's a point where you have to have some. You can't just be a wild, like, so what is that process? How does it work? And it's really confusing and difficult. Well, in a society, we have to have some level of that. I have to know how to deal with people at some level. How do we function, especially in, say, a primitive community where they don't have a singular unit of power, they don't have an economy? How do I know what needs to be done? How do I know that we need to build some chairs or hunting needs to get done or I deal with people? This happens through generalized repression and molding of the subject. And the investments of the social, historical, economic, political fields are all things that happen within sort of that space. And so how do we fix this? How do we set people up? How do we put them in a spot that this takes place or fix them? They use Oedipus as the example of a lot of this because for us, the Oedipalization of kind of everything is still happening today, which is kind of hilarious. But for them at the time, especially, everything was assumed to be Oedipus, and that Oedipus was like the foundational reality of all man, and it's not. And they're like, look, if we go back, there's these other ways that they fixed people or put people in their spot or trained people, I suppose would be another way to sort of think about it. This is the tone I understand it. Now, there may be someone who's far more well-spoken in Guattari who can probably talk through cure specifically, but to me, that's kind of the thing they're aiming at, if that answers.
I get a sense that in this paragraph, the primitive societies did not have a kind of a strict demarcation between the family unit and the socius, the social society, and that's because they didn't at that time they didn't have the Oedipal complex and the way that they are able to be a family unit at the same time, be part of the society is this kind of affine that says it constitutes the active concrete reality.
Yeah, I like
But
that. I like that.
right, right. But the Oedipus complex changes everything, and right once you get beyond that primitive state of economy, right? Before capitalism.
Yeah, no, I
So
think this early part when we're talking about the socialist specifically, the Earth, that they're trying not to be literal there, but it's the world, the place, the environment, the space that they're in is what organizes the entire reality of production. Because a socialist is that it's what organizes, and so the nature of what organizes is not a family. It's the Earth, the surroundings, your environment tells you as a group what you need to be doing, and kind of also earns that back and is also sort of attributed as the a priori cause. Even though you're the one who did it, you still say, oh, the Earth gave us this bounty, the Earth allowed us to have this massive feast, things like that. But it's definitely family as we know it does not, like as a trajectory of mother, father, son, doesn't exist in the same way in this socius at all, for sure.
So could you say that at that primitive level, the flow of desire and production is different than what it is in modern society?
Um, I'm just going to be nitpicky about phrasing. I wouldn't say the flows are different. The flows are the flows. Desiring machines haven't shifted over time. The organization of those flows and what controls them or represses them and how they get reorganized absolutely is what shifts. When we move, and we will see this, I don't want to get too far ahead, but when we move into the despot, for example, we move into a place where there is a hyper-hierarchicalized power that doesn't exist in this form. Now, there's some level of hierarchy within even anarcho-commune societies, you could argue. But we're talking about like with the despot, like a dude, the pharaoh, the sheik, the shah, the name a person, like the dude, the king who's in charge of things. Everything flows through or them. They are the body of it all. They are the embodiment of the state. And ultimately, they tell you how things get organized, how things are set up, and all of it. And maybe they're advisors, but they're the symbol of it. That organization still starts with the same desire. So the flows are there, but they're warped and changed based on the power structures. And capital adds in this other amazing thing, which is kind of incredible how capital really works as representation to actually reorganize yet again, but to do it from a place where it's not one person on high. Capital, despite having a hyper-hierarchicalized power structure, doesn't tell us how to be owned from on top. It's the paper that tells us, the capital itself that organizes. So it's the shifts in what controls production, but the flows generally are going to be the same. And I'm saying that with a big edge. Yeah.
But they're coded differently, right? There's a certain
Yes.
coding
Oh, for sure. For sure.
in a bartering society as opposed to when you introduce the money, exchange system. Then you have this decoding of the bartering flows and the encoding of the flows of monetary
Yes. Sorry.
symbolic.
Yes. Sorry. Yes. Coded flows, yes, are drastically different. Yes. I should have.
Right, right,
Sorry. That's on me.
right. So yeah, okay. I'm just trying to clarify for myself. Thank you.
Oh, no, for sure. That's a really great point. Other questions, other thoughts? Anything?
Could you explain how the Oedipal complex, you know, relates to the coding or decoding of the flows of desire and production? Um, are we Am I going ahead of myself or here, or
A,
have you
a
talked about that
smidge.
before?
Yeah. I mean, we haven't dove heavily into that, and we will about halfway through this chapter when we start really getting into capital. Like, a lot of this is their attempt at a universal history, where we can sort of point back and go, here is how things shift and change over time. Here's how they work. Here's the underlying stuff. And the decoding of flows is at this point like a foundational discussion, like talking through function. But with capital, we're really going to get into what they are, how they are. Like a few sections later, it gets wild. So I'll probably say, let's save that, but we can come back to it if they do more of it here. Does that not answer your question? Did I misunderstand?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
All right, cool. I will continue the next paragraph for now, though. Victor Turner gives a remarkable example of such a cure among the Ndembu. The example is the more striking, to our perverted eyes, for the fact that, at first glance, everything appears edible. Effeminate, insufferable, vain, failing at everything he tries, the sick K is preyed upon by the ghost of his maternal grandfather, who cruelly reproaches him. Although the Ndembu are matrilineal and must live with their maternal kin, K has stayed an exceptionally long time in the matrilineage of his father, whose favorite he was, and has entered into marriage with paternal cousins. But, with the death of his father, he is driven away and returns to the maternal village. There, his house expresses his situation well, being wedged between two sectors, the houses of the members of the paternal group and those belonging to his own matrilineage. How does the divination responsible for indicating the cause of the illness proceed, and the medical cure responsible for treating it? The teeth are the cause. The top two incisors of the ancestor hunter, contained in a sacred pouch, but which can escape from the pouch and penetrate the body of the sick man. In order to diagnose and ward off the effects of the incisor, the soothsayer and the medicine man launch into a social analysis concerning the territory and its environs, the chieftainship and its sub-chieftainships, the lineages and their segments, the alliances and filiations. They constantly bring to light desire and its relations with political and economic units, the very point on which, moreover, the witness try to mislead them. Open quote. Divination becomes a form of social analysis in the course of which hidden struggles between individuals and factions are brought to light in such a way that they can be treated by traditional ritual methods. The vague nature of mystical beliefs, allowing them to be manipulated in relation to a great number of social situations. End quote. It seems that the pathological incisor is indeed mainly that of the maternal grandfather, but the latter was a great chief. His successor, the real chief, has had to relinquish the throne for fear of being bewitched, and his would-be heir, intelligent and ambitious, does not exercise the power. The actual chief is not the real chief. As for the sick K, he has not been able to assume the role of mediator that could have made him a candidate for chief. Everything becomes complicated because of the colonizer-colonized relations. The English have not recognized the chieftainship. The impoverished village is falling into decrepitude. The two sectors of the village result from a fusion of two groups that had fled the English. The elders bemoan the current decadence. The medicine man does not organize a socio-drama, but a veritable group analysis, centering on a sick individual, giving him potions, attaching horns to his body for drawing up the incisor, making the drums beat. The medicine man proceeds with the ceremony, interrupted by halts and fresh departures, flows of all sorts, flows of words and breaks. The members of the village come to talk. The sick subject talks. The ghost is invoked. The medicine man explains. Everything recommences. Drums, chants, trances. It is not only a question of discovering the preconscious investments of a social field by interest, but, more profoundly, its unconscious investments by desire, such as they pass by way of the sick person's marriages, his position in the village, and all the positions of a chief lived in intensity within the group. I mean, it's kind of a schizoanalysis within the primitive setup is what they're talking through here. It may start where we say, oh, obviously, look, I mean, Jesus, this guy's grandfather, and he lived with his dad for too long. Freud would be like, done, thank you very much, off we go, next person. And they're saying, no, hold back. The way what they did, like even the medicine men and the shamans went like, hey, wait, there's more than just who daddy is and who mommy was. Let's have a conversation and work through all of these different complex things that are happening, from the way that they're being completely destroyed by the English, which is a horrifying story, all the way to how the English are doing it, how the tribes have had to be forced to come together, how the elders are handling it, the incredibly complex social structure that has produced Kay and his illness. Even then, and their method of going through this, we may see as this, quaint, odd little ritual of dancing and drums and noise and all of that. But wait, no, this is a little bit more than that. This is a group analysis that centers on the sick individual. People are there, they give him things, they take care of him, they respond to him, they talk to him, he talks back. Flows of all sorts, words and breaks. Members of the village talk, the sick subject talk, ghost. This is how they dealt with this in the primitive. How they dealt with this here is not through, oh, cool, let's talk about representations, but instead, literally, what is this man dealing with? And let's all work on it, because the reality of it is more complex. Questions, comments, thoughts? It's a really amazing paragraph. And it's worth reading through. I've had the footnote here, and I cannot find, I think I closed my notes because I'm just a mess today, apparently. We said that the point of departure seemed Oedipal. It was only the point of departure for us, conditioned to say Oedipus every time someone speaks to us of father, mother, grandfather. In fact, the Ndimbu analysis was never Oedipal. It was directly plugged into social organization and disorganization. Sexuality itself, through the women in the marriages, was just an investment of desire. The parents played the role of stimuli in it, not the role of group organizers or disorganizers. The role held by the chief and his personages. Rather than everything being reduced to the name of the father or that of the maternal grandfather, the latter opened onto all the names of history. Instead of everything being projected onto a grotesque hiatus of castration, everything was scattered in the thousands of breaks, flows of the chieftainships, lineages, the relations of colonization. The whole interplay of races, clans, alliances, and filiations, this entire historical and collective drift, exactly the opposite of the Oedipal analysis, when it stubbornly crushes the content of a delirium, when it stuffs it with all its might into the symbolic void of the father. Or rather, if it is true that the analysis doesn't even begin as Oedipal, except to our way of seeing, doesn't it become Oedipal nevertheless in a certain way? And in what way? Yes, it becomes Oedipal in part, under the effect of colonization. The colonizer, for example, abolishes the chieftainship or uses it to further his own ends, and he uses many other things besides. The chieftainship is only the beginning. Colonizer says, your father is your father and nothing else. Your maternal grandfather, don't mistake them for chiefs. You can go have yourself triangulated in your corner and place your house between those of your paternal and maternal kin. Your family is your family and nothing else. Sexual reproduction no longer passes through those points, although we rightly need your family to furnish a material that will be subjected to a new order of reproduction. Yes, then, an Oedipal framework is outlined for the dispossessed primitives, a shantytown Oedipus. We have seen, however, that the colonized remained a typical example of resistance to Oedipus. In fact, that's where the Oedipal structure does not manage to close itself, and where the terms of the structure remain stuck to the agents of oppressive social reproduction, either in a struggle or in a complicity. The white man, the missionary, the tax collector, the exporter of goods, the person with standing in the village who becomes the agent of the administration, the elders who curse the white man, the young people who enter into political struggle, etc. Both are true. The colonized resists Oedipalization, and Oedipalization tends to close around him again. To the degree that there is Oedipalization, it is due to colonization. It is necessary to add Oedipalization to all the methods that Jalin was able to describe in La Page Blanche. Quote, "The condition of the colonized can lead to a reduction in the humanization of the universe, so that any solution that is sought will be a solution on the scale of the individual and the restricted family with, by way of consequence, an extreme anarchy or disorder at the level of the collective. An anarchy whose victim will always be the individual, with the exception of those who occupy the key positions in such a system, namely, the colonizers, who during this same period, when the colonized reduce the universe, will tend to extend it." Before we go on, I want to read the footnote from Robert Jolin. Introduction to Ethnocide. Phenomenal. There is an English translation. We have it somewhere on the server. Jolin analyzes the situation of the Indians whom the Capuchins persuaded to abandon the collective house in favor of small personal houses. In the collective house, the familial apartment and personal intimacy were based on a relationship with the neighbor defined as an ally, so that interfamilial relations were coextensive with the social field. In the new situation, on the contrary, there occurred an excessive ferment of the elements of the couple affecting the couple itself and the children, so that the restrictive family closes into an expressive microcosm where each person reflects his own lineage, while the social and productive destiny escapes him more and more. For Oedipus is not only an ideological process, but the result of a destruction of the environment, the habitat, etc. To continue. Oedipus is something like euthanasia within ethnocide. The more social reproduction escapes the members of the groups, in nature and in extension, the more it falls back on them, or reduces them to a restricted and neuroticized familial reproduction, whose agent is Oedipus. It's a really shitload of stuff right there. There's probably a paragraph break in there that I missed that happens, but not in my PDF, so be it. Still, ridiculously good paragraph. Long. Let me go back a step. Oh, good. It's not in the... No, thank you. Good to know, Tiernan. The opening here is, I think, the most important point of the paragraph. All of it is like they're giving a big preview into what's coming in the rest of this section. But we said the point of departure seemed Oedipal, and it was only the point of departure for us, conditioned to say Oedipus every time someone speaks of father, mother, grandfather, etc. That is a big one. The second part where they're like, actually, no, this was never Oedipal. These are deeply social, political. These are extremely different. It's a different reality for all these people. The interplay of races, clans, alliances, affiliations, entire historical and collective drift is exactly the opposite of the Oedipal analysis. But then the analysis comes in and it says, oh, because of colonization or whatever's happening, oh no, you're this big group. We don't do that. And we're not cool with you doing it, especially generally for religious reasons and the ability for us to completely control. We don't want large groups of houses because large alliances are gross to us. Everyone has to be a family. Like, why? You have 12 families living in a house? No, you're stopping that. You're becoming civilized. Please join us now. Civilized, separate homes. Can you have a garden? We're going to show you how to like mow your lawn and edge your yard, but you're never going to touch it. Like, it's this hyper-Oedipalization that happens. And what happens as this sort of comes in is you can resist this. Like, they're like, yeah, this happens. The horrifying part, though, is as you resist it, you become more of an agent of it in the same time. It wraps around. Oedipus is horrifying that way because as the representation takes hold, as this contingent network gets defined for you, it suffocates you, Remke. Exactly. It pushes you. The more you fight back, it's quicksand. The more you fight, the worse it gets. And it's a really, really concise way to look at it, and also really horrifying to read out loud.
So could you say that the Oedipalization, takes the extended family, which it may include a whole tribe of people, a community, and makes the family unit by edibilization, a nuclear family, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly it. But it's not even just that. It's suddenly you have relations and definitions of those relations that you didn't have before. That's like the thrust. You like all of these people everyone had a mom and a dad, as far as if we want to call a mom or a dad, the woman who gave birth to me, and dad, the one who, contributed sperm to that process. And I have a sister who's like the female version of that as part of this. Like these coordinates sort of existed. I have a grandfather. These people had grandfathers. Like we're still human. The definition of what mother, father, family means changes drastically, though. It changes drastically. And that shift into, hey, the larger tribe or family or my familial line, which is a large network of uncles, aunts, nieces, brothers, sisters, cousins, Steve, who ran away and parents were killed, so he moved in with us, or whatever. Like I like this large network. The switch to being a family and having that defined, they use the example here, and it's a crisp one of saying you can't have these large homes with a whole bunch of people living in it. That's ridiculous. You have to switch to these other homes. You have to move right into them, and they are small personal houses, which is amazing. That's the quote they used in the line. It's really the introduction to ethnocide is amazing to read through, and it's a lot of imagery like that. We spent a lot of time on the server talking recently about the boarding schools that Native Americans were put in and how that operated and how they absolutely broke down entire families, forced children away from their parents, cut their hair. Like the way that people related to the world changed as this happened. And it wasn't that we beat them into submission until they became American. It's the way it operates is by changing the way that they handle representations and how their desire is manufactured inside of everything they're doing. Like, yes, we did beat and mutilate and burn a whole lot of people, for sure. That can't just be it. Like, there's got to be other things that sort of shift a person. And as they talk about this, like, that's kind of their point here, is there's this underlying stuff that's happening with representation and how it gets pushed on. Oh, all right. After all, how are we to understand those who claim to have discovered an Indian Oedipus or an African Oedipus? They are the first to admit that they encounter none of the mechanisms or attitudes that constitute our own Oedipus, our own presumed Oedipus. No matter. They say that the structure is there, although it has no existence, whatever that is accessible to clinical practice, or that the problem, the point of departure, is indeed Oedipal, although the developments in the solutions are completely different from ours. They say that there is no end to the existence of Oedipus, when in fact it does not even have, apart from colonization, the necessary conditions to begin to exist. If it is true that thought can be evaluated in terms of the degree of Oedipalization, then yes, whites think too much. Sorry, it's the first time I've understood that line. It's a great line. The competence, the honesty, and the talent of these authors. Sorry, that line's just fucking great. Just wait. Nazis are going to come in here. Oh, thank you so much. Whites do think too much. Wait, are you dissing us? If it is true that thought can be evaluated in terms of degree of Oedipalization, then yes, whites think too much. The competence, the honesty, and the talent of these authors, psychoanalysts specializing in Africa, are beyond question. But the same applies to them as to certain psychotherapists here. It would seem that they don't know what they are doing. We have psychotherapists who sincerely believe they are engaged in progressive work when they apply new methods for triangulating the child. But watch out, a structural Oedipus, and this time it isn't imaginary. The same is true of psychoanalysts in Africa who apply the yoke of a structural or problematical Oedipus in the service of their progressive intentions. There or here, it's the same thing. Oedipus is always colonization pursued by other means. It is the interior colony. We shall see that even here at home, where the Europeans are concerned, it is our intimate colonial education. I do
Man,
like that line.
this is really provocative, huh? Although it is to me, this makes a lot of sense because it becomes so visually clear when you think about the very cringe side of good how do you call it, like the like I forgot all the names of all the organizations, but I recently saw that movie White Cube by Renzo Martins. I don't know if you know it.
Oh God, no. Jesus, you always come
It's
to me with these recommendations.
it's a very interesting movie. It's a follow-up from the movie Enjoy Poverty, which well, the title says already a little bit of the subject. And it's sort of trying to lay out the mechanics of how the art world is exploiting um, Congo in this case. And
The-
it is through this very, very similar to what Deleuze and Guattari are describing in this paragraph. Where with the best intentions, you have this superiority based on the presupposition of how things are supposed to be, that creates a hierarchy that is inescapable for everybody joining the mechanics of the art world. So
Yeah.
the goal of that movie is to try to get Congolese artists basically shown at paid exhibitions, but by doing that, they completely have to submit to the white cube, and of course, the white cube being the room of an exhibition, but also the space, the white space of white, the space of white identity.
That sounds
Or
so.
white.
It's on my list. We'll add it to our watches. That's amazing. But no, and it's exactly that. I'm just a quick read through the bio in your description. It's like, look, and it's a lot that they're saying here, but they're like, look, the competence, the honesty, and the talent of these authors, these people that they're critiquing. They're like, look, beyond question, and like these dudes know what they're doing. They're quite clever. They've really spent the time, and they genuinely believe this, but they don't know what they're doing. They don't realize that by starting this line, we're having a discussion about with Loomer and a few others in the chat about the prohibition on premarital sex that is very common in America, and why, like, how would, and the question was like, how does that work? Is Deleuze and Guattari, do they say like that's what makes people want to have sex? And it's like, no, like it's not like the demand to not drives like specifically like turns me around and I go, yeah, that's why I want to do it. It's because prior to that, when a kid's like 10 and you say, hey, you can't go fuck anyone, like they don't know what that means. They don't, a baby doesn't have an idea what sex is. As they get older, they have generalized hormonal urges. Like there's that forms. But the actual moment when you've said, don't do thing X, don't go have sex, now sex is a thing. And sex has been defined and it's a representation. And by doing this thing, which probably has like all the best intentions at heart, and I know parents, I remember parents who really loved their kids, who really did this. My parents really loved me. They did the same thing. It gives you a goal. It gives you here's a representation and here's your relation to it. And it defines your entire reality. By going and doing this thing where we're talking about Oedipus in Africa, they truly can believe all that they want. It doesn't mean anything. There was no Oedipus there. By showing up, they've actually inserted this representation. They've actually gone through the process of creating the representations in the network that generates the Oedipus complex itself. They planted the seed that they watered and grew, and then went, see, I told you, there was always that fucking seed there. And it's like, they don't even know they're doing it. They don't even know.
Yeah, but it's a very provocative film, so I don't watch it to only agree with it, I would say.
It's my favorite documentary of all time is The Killing. Oh my God.
The Act of Killing, yes.
The Act of
amazing,
Killing.
yeah.
It was the same thing. I don't even know if I agree with the documentary. I just know that it's one of the most powerful things I've ever seen. So,
Yes, fucking insane. I love it too.
All right. Any other questions or comments on this shorter paragraph before we move on? How are we to understand the phrases with which MC and Edmund Ortega's conclude their book? Quote, illness is considered as a sign of an election, of a special attention coming from supernatural powers, or as a sign of an aggression of a magical nature, an idea that is difficult to express in profane terms. Analytical psychotherapy can intervene only starting from the moment a demand can be formulated by the subject. Our entire research was therefore conditioned by the possibility of establishing a psychoanalytic domain. When a subject adhered fully to the traditional norms and had nothing to say in his own name, he allowed himself to be taken into the care of the traditional therapists in the familial group or into that of the medical practice of medicines. At times, the fact that he wanted to speak to us about traditional treatments corresponded to a beginning of psychotherapy and became for him a means of situating himself personally in his own society. At other times, the analytic dialogue was able to unfold to a greater extent, and in this case, the Oedipal problem tended to assume its diachronic dimension, causing the generation gap to appear. End quote. Why think that supernatural powers and magical aggressions constitute a myth that is inferior to Oedipus? On the contrary, is it not true that they move desire in the direction of more intense and more adequate investments of the social field, in its organization as well as its disorganizations? Meyerfort, or at least showed Job's place beside Oedipus, and what entitles one to determine that the subject has nothing to say in his own name so long as he adheres to traditional norms? Doesn't the Ndembu cure demonstrate just the opposite? Could it not be said that Oedipus is also a traditional norm, our own to be exact? How can one say that Oedipus makes us speak in our own name, when one also goes on to say that its resolution teaches us the incurable inadequacy of being and universal castration? And what is this demand that is invoked to justify Oedipus? It goes without saying, the subject demands and redemands daddy mommy, but which subject and in what state? Is that the means to situate oneself personally in one's own society? And which society? The neo-colonized society that is constructed for the subject and that finally succeeds in what colonization was only able to outline? An effective reduction of the forces of desire to Oedipus to a father's name in the grotesque triangle? My favorite part, quickly, is the laugh about why are you saying sorcery? Why are you saying magic doesn't count, but Oedipus does? That reminds me of I don't know why, Satanic Bible, Anton LaVey, how he talked about magic and demons and how they were all just allegories and just as valuable as a lot of things we considered inside of stuff. Just felt, first time I read this even, felt like a little bit of that poking through. I just like that line. Is it not true that they move desire in the direction of more intense and more adequate investments of the social field? Is the turning point and the point of this paragraph? Like, hey, like you shit on their rituals, but hey, we're talking about like actually changing how a person's desire moves. So does it matter if it's some crazy ritual there where they're chanting and hitting someone with sticks, or if someone's laying on a couch? Like what's the difference? Like, one seems more civilized, I think would be and I'm putting that in quotes, would probably be someone's answer, but like they're kind of like, hey, no, we gotta talk about these things. We're talking about moving desire and changing how it relates. Questions, thoughts? Ken, JK? Oh, webcam. Welcome, webcam parrot. I love the new avatar, by the way.
It's actually the old avatar.
Oh, well, it's newer to me.
Recycled.
It works for me. All right, I'm going to assume that my analysis is wonderful and perfect. That sounds great. Anyone? Come on, gotta have a question somewhere.
Maybe I'll come up with a question as I go along. But yeah, I mean, so there's
Well, we lost Ken, so that was fun. Also probably good because his mic literally felt like I was driving needles into my ear. What happened?
this ain't working for me.
No, that was me. I was trying to blame me. That's me. I'm sorry about that. That was I was trying to right click and change your user volume, and I accidentally clicked on moving you to like AFK. So that was my fault. I take blame for that. The timing was genuinely comedic, so I will also take credit for that at least. So, but sorry. So please go ahead.
Yeah, so psychoanalysis is a rich bulletin that does things to desire, and Freud sort of shits on all of these other practices as being infantile, whatever forms of whatever. I don't know. I like how this is stated here, and I don't really see any sort of fundamental truth value difference between. Well, maybe I do, but not in favor of psychoanalysis. Between initiation rites of any other sort of peoples, and then psychoanalysis, because I think at bottom what psychoanalysis is a practice of initiation. You've got all of the fundamentals there, and initiation rites aren't necessarily a bad thing per se. They can be abused. I guess they're dangerous, and they often are abused, but in a lot of ways, it helps to get some sort of sense of belonging, if that's something someone's looking for, and all these other things. I think there's a strong argument that what white people have done with whitewashing in a lot of ways is a compensation for some sort of loss of initiation practice ever since, or whatever. You can take it all the way back to so-called paganism. But yeah, so psychoanalysis is a practice of initiation, but it likes to believe it's not.
No, I love that, and it's the line specifically. It's ultimately it's about, and it's one of the reasons that you'll find a lot of interesting people who come to Deleuze and Guattari from all over. Ken, who's got the Jungian, Lacan, like pure psychoanalytic background all the way to like people who play in ethnology, or people who play like me in design of games and interactive. Like, you're talking ultimately about the same thing, which is about learning how to move desire around and how desire plays inside of things. And it doesn't matter like what method you're using if it works. Like, it's almost like if it works, and it just works. So yeah, it does it over here. Don't shit on their version of it over here. It does the same thing. It plays with desire and moves it in the direction of more adequate investments of the social field, which I think it's a great phrasing to say. Initiation, I think, is a great way to put it.
So Freud was actually pretty accurate, astute in capturing, what the unconscious structure, which is the Oedipus complex, are operating at least at his time in history, after the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of maybe going actually back to the beginning of capitalism. But but it also suggests that this kind of complex was from the very beginning, going back to the Greek mythology, laying down that this kind of structure was there, in the unconscious.
I think, and Ken, correct me or webcam if I'm wrong. I'd say yes. I think Freud got a whole bunch of stuff like hugely right. Like, the most important thing is to say that he's the guy who's the reason we talk about moving desire or desire as a thing, the idea of libido as a force. And I know it came around that time, and it wasn't just Freud, but Freud is absolutely the popularization of the idea. Like, without that, a lot of this doesn't work. And so Freud nailed that. And the ability of identifying Oedipus, because it's accurate. We have these things, cathexis as well. Like, Freud did a whole bunch of amazing shit. I would say for him, though, and they will get into this, I don't know about extending it back to the Greek. What I would say is, for sure, it's his way of identifying, and he's not wrong, about how the organization of production and repression happens where he happened to be, which was bougie, sort of industrial, pre-industrial Europe, white land. And he's spot on. Like, that's 100% how it functioned then, and now how it functions now. So him looking back through all of time, which a lot of these people do, and we will get into the despotic, where Freud very much, everyone wants a daddy figure. That's why everyone likes a dictator, or how dictators worked is through Oedipus. It's like, sort of, no, we gotta talk. So we'll get there. But yeah, no, Freud discovered a whole bunch of this shit and figured out a bunch of it. Unless I'm wrong.
Yeah, one little note. Oedipus for the Greeks is different than Oedipus for Freud. Sure, they're similar, but Freud takes, like Oedipus was a key myth for the Greek socius, but just like Faust is for some or most Germans or whatever. But it was just very much a different thing.
Let us return to the well-known and inexhaustible debate between culturalists and orthodox psychoanalysts. Is Oedipus universal? Is Oedipus the great paternal Catholic symbol, the meeting place of all the churches? The debate began between Malinowski and Jones. It continued between Gardner and Fromm on the one side and Royheim on the other. It is still pursued between certain ethnologists and certain disciples of Lacan, those who offered not only an Oedipalizing interpretation of Lacan's doctrine, but also an ethnographic extension to this interpretation. On the side of the universal, there are two poles. One, outdated it would seem, that makes of Oedipus an original affective constellation, and that constitutes an extreme position, arguing that Oedipus was a real event whose effects were transmitted through phylogenetic heredity. And the other pole, which makes Oedipus into a structure, a pole whose extreme position argues the possibility of discovering the structure in fantasy in relation to biological pre-maturation and neoteny. Two very different conceptions of the limit, one as original matrix, the other as structural function, but in both these senses of the universal, we are invited to interpret, since the latent presence of Oedipus appears only through its patent absence, understood as an effect of psychic repression, or better still, since the structural constant is discovered only through its imaginary variations, attesting to the need for a symbolic foreclosure, father as an empty position. Oedipus as universal recommences the old metaphysical operation that consists in interpreting negation as a deprivation, as a lack, the symbolic lack of the dead father or the great signifier. Interpretation is our modern way of believing and of being pious. Already, Royheim proposed organizing primitives into a series of variables converging towards the structural neotenic constant. It was he who said in all seriousness that the Oedipus complex was not to be found if it wasn't looked for, and that one wasn't looking if one hadn't had oneself analyzed. And that is why your daughter is mute, which is to say, the tribes, daughters of the ethnologist, do not say Oedipus, although it is Oedipus who makes them speak. Roheim added that it was ridiculous to think that the Freudian theory of censorship depended on the repressive regime in the empire of Franz Joseph. He did not seem to see that Franz Joseph was not a pertinent historical break, but that perhaps the oral, the written, or even capitalist civilizations were such breaks with which the nature of social repression and the meaning and scope of psychic repression would vary. Continuing the same core thought, extending it out through a handful of very quick points to now bring up a few people in the world of Lacan. I will tell you, there are people, I've met them, who believe that there was an event that transmitted through history that was Oedipus as a thing. This exists, I guess. Whatever. But the other side for sure does. And that's the Lacanian side, where it's a structure that exists in all of our fantasies. And it is sort of a priori. Ken, do you want to give a little bit, maybe a deeper talk of that? Or webcam, anyone who may know a little bit more about Lacan than I do? Maybe speak a little bit. Or we can skip it. Like, it's not like it matters a ton right now. This is all just Guattari doing his criticizing of his old boss.
I mean, I guess just briefly, it's like, how do you situate yourself within rules of being or whatever that are already disfiguring and alienating. And that's sort of the edible thing. So you have impossibility on one side and then a prohibition erected on that impossibility. And that'd be the phallus or whatever. And yeah, most Lacanians definitely think that this is like a universal thing. That castration is universal, that there's an absolute limit to love and knowledge, and then the various ways in which you break along these fault lines describe your subject position. But I mean, quickly, there is no subject in Lacanian psychoanalysis. There's a barred subject, and a full subject is sort of this phantasm of sorts, or a specific position might consider themselves a full subject. But there is no full subject. There's a signifier that always speaks to another signifier. So that's a major difference. And then, but I think what sort of gets missed is that there's all sorts of assumptions behind this. For example, that like the signifier even exists, or that the signifier is something that without having to learn it is effective. You know, I don't know. So
Yeah,
I don't
it's
think it's the universal thing, but I think depending on where you're from, it could be working in the underground, sort of speak, and then you realize how it's working later on.
yeah, and I think I would even go so far as to say, I think even the casual people who are into a great deal of this or play in this space tend towards it's a structure that is determinate. The idea of castration, I always bring up my man Z. Zizek is absolutely in this space, and so are a lot of the people in the space around him, and pretty normal. But again, their question, it's the same thing as it has been. The line that they even laugh about here, Geza Roheim, it was he who said, in all seriousness, that the Oedipus complex was not to be found if it wasn't looked for, which is, I mean, a pretty fantastically, almost self-aware kind of way to talk about it. And then in order to look for it, you also had to be analyzed and shrunk yourself. And it's a hell of a... That to find it, you also have to be Oedipalized, and then you have to be looking for Oedipus. You wouldn't find it otherwise. Like, why would you be able to find a thing unless you absolutely had it beaten into you?
Yeah, for sure. And there's that initiation.
Always.
But one of the things I do find helpful about the Lacanian side of things is that, there is no true self or whatever. And that
I think Guattari would
becomes
agree with you. Like, there's a lot he took straight away from Lacan. Like, I'm not saying, like, I love how he shits on Lacan. He does it a lot, but it's like almost with love, because he takes just a ton from him. So please continue.
I think after Anti-Oedipus, even though it seems, in the ether that Lacan didn't respond well to it, it definitely seems that he changed his tune a little bit and ended up saying that, Oedipus is sort of, it's no longer relevant in the clinic or something like that. And then he moves a little bit harder into jouissance and topology and moves away from the signifier. So it would have been nice to have seen Deleuze and Guattari engage with late stage Lacan. I think that's what we're missing.
You think here Deleuze is incorporating Lacan's idea of the lack in the object A? This lack is a part of that desire of production that is constantly in a state of lack.
I mean, I think they get rid of the notion of lack altogether. I mean, not altogether. I think they suggest that like lack is a production of surplus or something.
Yeah, lack isn't a negative to them. So, like, and again, I think Deleuze has a tenuous understanding of Lacan, but Guattari far ridiculously good. The idea with him is that I believe my understanding, lack is not a negative. For Lacan, it is like it's a black hole inside of you, kind of thing. That there's a negative space, almost like antimatter. And that's why when people hear that and then they hear the concept, as they talked about here, and they will, of anti-production, people assume, oh, that's lack. It's a negative. It eliminates. And it's like, no, it's lack is actually an almost like it's a stamp you put on a box next to a box that says desire. They're both things in the process. They're not a negative. It's lack is actually a blocking anti-production setup that works against production. It's not a negative force that sort of is destructive or absent. So it's an inversion of it pretty significantly.
But I think the way objectivity works and its sort of position in Lacan's system does have some parallels. So I'm curious what parallels you saw that had you ask that question.
Well, when Deleuze talks about the in capitalism, there is this not just production desire, production of production, but the production of fantasy. And in that idea of fantasy, is what drives the constant production that leads to lack. And this kind of, infinite lack. There's an infinite lack there. Once you get caught up in this kind of desire of, infinite desire, in which this advertising and so forth and commercialization is a form of fantasy, where you can never fulfill yourself, right? But you just have that desire, and that desire is like the object a constant unfulfillment of desire, which is lack.
Yeah. So I still think we don't have to talk about affirmation or negation here to find the similarity. And the similarity is that what desire desires is desire itself. Desire does not desire an object, and this seems to be true for both Deleuze and Guattari and Lacan. And then they differ in the extremities. But that's a very important point here, right? And insofar as we've been talking about the repressive representation or whatever, and what Brooks was talking about, how you're given a goal for your desire, and that sort of funnels you into it, like with the example with sex and whatnot. Lacan would rails against ego psychology and object relations for precisely this reason, because that's not desire. So I think we can talk about this sort of not never-ending slippage or whatever of desire. Just that desire doesn't have a telos per se. Desire doesn't have an end goal. There is no single thing that finally fulfills desire, because to do that is to die, right? But the difference here, I think, is that, like, maybe for Deleuze and Guattari, that like the representations in your dreams wouldn't be telling you anything about what you desire, whereas for maybe the psychoanalytic club, it's like the royal road to the unconscious or whatever. Does that make sense, or did I just say a whole bunch of stuff that
It made sense to me. I'm waiting for making sure JK is good.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I just referring to this on page 26, kind of way back, way in the middle of the page. He says that in a word, when the theoretician reduces desiring production to a production of the fantasy, he is content to exploit to the fullest the idealist principle that defines desire as a lack rather than a process of production. of industrial production. So that seems to be kind of like a negative interpretation of what the lack is, right? He's critiquing this kind of capitalistic production of desire and production and fantasy and lack.
Yeah, it seems to be a negative interpretation of fantasy. It's pairing fantasy directly with lack, um, which I think is interesting. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, but I think you're talking about Lacan's notion of lack at a kind of more you know ontological level or something, metaphysical level, right?
Hmm. And with that I think they say that fantasies are always group fantasies or collective fantasies, right? And so that's pointing at this capitalist mode of desire and representation that I think that you were trying to point out for us. So the fantasy of esteem or status, you know, that sort of floats around. You've got all these YouTube influencers and this strange Instagram thing going on. And like the what really just destroyed me was this um, like when COVID was, maybe whenever we were just getting into it, there were all these arguments like, should we just let all these people die and save the economy, or save the people and then maybe the economy won't be doing so well. And that just killed me. And I think that's an example of this collective fantasy thing, that like we exalt our rich or our oligarchs as if we could be one of them as well one day or something like that. I think that's maybe an example of what you were getting at as far as this group fantasy and capitalist mode of representation lack.
Love it. And we should, JK, let's make sure, if you have any of these questions, it'd be worthwhile popping into the Anti-Oedipus chat afterwards and saying, hey, let's have a discussion around this, because I think it actually would be worthwhile, because lack is a very, it's not something people spend a lot of time speaking of when it comes to desiring production. Some do, but there's less written on it. So I think it'd be worth having the chat for sure. I'm very interested to dive in for sure. But I will continue to the next paragraph. Talk about repression and lack. Let's see if we can get there. This story of repression is quite complicated. Things would be simpler if the libido or the affect were repressed, in the most general sense of the word, suppressed, inhibited, or transformed, at the same time as the supposed Oedipal representation. But such is not the case. Most ethnologists have clearly noted the sexual nature of affects in the public symbols of primitive societies, and this nature remains integrally lived by the members of these societies, even though they have not been psychoanalyzed, and in spite of the displacement of the representation. As Leach says apropos of the sex-hair relationship, displaced phallic symbolism is very common, but the phallic origin of the symbolism is not repressed. Must it be said that primitives repress the representation and keep the affect intact? And would the contrary be true in our case, in the patriarchal organization where the representation would remain clear, but with the affects suppressed, inhibited, and transformed? No, in fact. Psychoanalysis tells us that we too repress the representation, and everything tells us that we too often keep the full sexuality of the affect. We know perfectly well what it is about without having been psychoanalyzed. But what enables one to speak of an Oedipal representation that would be the object of repression? Is it because incest is prohibited? We always fall back on this pale rationale. Incest is desired because it is prohibited, and it would be born of the repression of this representation of the latter's return. Now, the opposite is clearly the case. Not only does the Oedipal representation presuppose the prohibition of incest, but it is not even possible to say that the representation is born of the prohibition or results from it. Yeah, and incest in general, like, as a generalized thing, it was not done. But incest and the prohibition and the oedipalization of it as we know it now is not the same thing. To go back, this is the paralogism of the displaced representative, where, hey, you can't fuck your mom. And then you have incest in your head, and you're like, oh, I can't. Well, okay, I take that, and I put it over here, and desire's still going underneath. Desire doesn't want that. Like, desire doesn't know what full bodies are. It doesn't have any concept of the representation. So, but now it's shoved underneath, repressed, powering that incest, basically powering that desire, pushing it out, and now it's been sort of pushed off in a new thing. So they're finally coming around and saying, like, look, not only, and I'll say the last line again, not only does the Oedipal representation presuppose the prohibition of incest. If we are to have an Oedipal representation at all, there's always got to be Oedipal representation of the prohibition of incest. There always has to be there. But no, not just that though. It's not even possible to say that the representation is born of the prohibition and results from it, because now it's a chicken and egg thing. Not to go back to an egg thing inside of a Deleuze talk. I try to avoid that, but it's a chicken and egg thing, because now it's the representation is born of the prohibition. It results from the prohibition. Well, it's a prohibition also is presupposed with the representation. So, now we're just chasing ourselves. That's not how it works. Easier paragraph, shorter paragraph. Comments, questions, anything? Yeah, people want to fuck chickens. That exists as a thing too.
Didn't the Egyptians practice incest to some extent? At least the royalty?
I mean, a lot of the Habsburgs did, for sure. I think it was incest. We'll get to incest and the despot, because we're still at this point. We're still in the first socius, whatever it is, the primitive. We haven't gotten to the despotic, which is the pharaoh, the kings, the Habsburg, all that. Yeah, they get super incesty, but they have a different. And again, we talk about how the representation works and plays, and how desire plays within that. There's a reason that they give that's pretty strong. We'll get to that though. I don't want to jump too far ahead. But yes, the answer is yeah, they're super incesty. Yes, to say what Ken's saying, incest is in myths all around the world, time immemorial, basically. All kinds of tribes and all kinds of things. So, yeah. Exactly. Thank you, Ken. The consequences and the couplings are different. The social strata, the coordinates that I am inside of society and how I relate and how they work, they're different. It's not as we talk about it with the Oedipal or the prohibition on it or how it works as representation. It's a different beast. That's kind of their overall point. Let's continue though. Adopting Malinowski's arguments, Reich added a profound remark. Desire is all the more Oedipal as the prohibitions are aimed, not simply at incest, but at all other types of sexual relations, blocking the other paths. In a word, the repression of incest is not born of a repressed Oedipal representation any more than it provokes this repression. But, and this is something altogether different, the general social repression psychic repression, the general social repression psychic repression system gives rise to an Oedipal image as a disfiguration of the repressed. This has to be Guattari every time. The fact that this image in turn finally suffers a repression, that it comes to take the place of the repressed, or of the thing that is effectively desired, insofar as sexual repression is directed at something other than incest, such is the long history of our society. But the repressed is not first of all the Oedipal representation. What is repressed is desiring production. It is the part of this production that does not enter into social production or reproduction. It is what would introduce disorder and revolution into the socius, the non-coded flows of desire. The part that passes, on the contrary, from desiring production to social production forms a direct sexual investment of the social production without any repression of a sexual nature of the symbolism and the corresponding affects, and, above all, without any reference to an Oedipal representation that could be held to be originally repressed or structurally foreclosed. The animal in us is not merely the object of a preconscious investment determined by interest, but the object of a libidinal investment of desire that only secondarily derives an image of the father from desiring production. The same holds true for the libidinal investment of food, wherever a fear of going hungry is evident, or a pleasure at not being hungry, and this investment refers only secondarily to an image of the mother. We have already seen how the prohibition of incest referred not to Oedipus, but to the non-coded flows that constitute desire, and to their representative, the intense prepersonal flow. As for Oedipus, it is another way of coding the uncodable, of codifying what eludes the codes, or of displacing desire in its object, a way of entrapping them. To go back to JK's earlier question, here we are now talking about coding and where it happens and how. It's the non-coded flows of desire that do not enter the socius is what we're talking about. The line here that really matters: the animal in us is not merely the object of a preconscious investment determined by interest, but the object of a libidinal investment of desire that only secondarily derives an image of the father from desiring production. The animal in us. That's the line. To be originally, it's this setup and how preconscious investments actually work, how desire functions. That's the really nice crisp sentence. Libidinal investment of food, wherever a fear of going hungry is evident, or a pleasure at not being hungry, and this investment refers only secondarily to an image of the mother. Culturalists and ethnologists have demonstrated that institutions are primary in relation to affects and structures, or structures are not mental, they are present in things, in the forms of social production and reproduction. Even an author like Marcuse, whom one would not suspect of complacence in this regard, acknowledges that culturalism started on the right track, introducing desire into production, strengthening the link between instinctual and economic structure, and at the same time indicating the possibility of progress beyond the patricentric acquisitive culture. Then what caused culturalism to go wrong? And here again, there is no contradiction in the fact that it started on the right track and that it went wrong from the start. Perhaps the answer lies in the postulate common to Oedipal relativism and Oedipal absolutism, i.e., the stubborn maintenance of a familialist perspective, which wreaks havoc everywhere. For if the institution is first understood as familial institution, it matters little to say that the familial complex varies with the institutions, or that Oedipus is, to the contrary, a nuclear constant around which families and institutions turn. The culturalists invoke other triangles, maternal uncle, aunt, nephew, for example, but the Oedipalists have no difficulty in demonstrating that these are imaginary variations of one and the same structural constant, different figures of one and the same symbolic triangulation, which are not identical either with the personages who come to realize the triangulation or with the attitudes that come to place these personages in relation to each other. But inversely, the invocation of such a transcendent symbolism does not rescue the structuralists from the narrowest familial point of view. The same holds for the endless debates on, is it daddy? Is it mommy? You are neglecting the mother. No, you're the one who fails to see the father off to the side as the empty position. Sounds like they're talking about someone specific they've talked to, I guess there. But it's a little bit of what Ken was saying earlier as well. The debate within these groups. Really crisp paragraph. Any questions, comments, thoughts? All right, I'll keep going then. The conflict between culturalists and orthodox psychoanalysts has often been reduced to these evaluations of the respective roles of the mother and the father, or of the pre-Oedipal and the Oedipal, without allowing either side to leave the family, or even Oedipus, always oscillating between the famous two poles, the pre-Oedipal maternal pole of the imaginary and the Oedipal paternal pole of the structural, both on the same axis, both speaking the same language of a familialized social realm, where one pole designates the customary maternal dialects, while the other designates the imperative law of the language of the father. The ambiguity of what Gardner called the primary institution has been clearly shown. In certain cases, it can be a question of the way desire invests the social field from childhood, and under the familial stimuli coming from the adult. All the conditions would then be given for an adequate, extrafamilial understanding of the libido. But more often, it is solely a question of the familial organization in itself, which is thought to be lived first by the child as a microcosm, then projected onto the adult and social development. From this point of view, the discussion can only go round in circles between the holders of a cultural interpretation and the holders of a symbolic or structural interpretation of the same organization. To read the footnote, Michel Dufresne, analyzing the concepts of Gardner, raises these essential questions. Is it the family that is primary, while the political, economic, social are merely secondary? Which comes first from the viewpoint of the libido, the familial investment or the social? And methodologically, is it necessary to go from the child to the adult or from the adult to the child? These are really good questions. It's a really crisp critique here. Anyone have a question about the foundation they're critiquing or comments on it?
I got comments as always. So yeah, I mean, the social seems. I mean, if we have to say one is primary, I think the easier one to stand on is the social. But I don't think you can just put one before the other in an easy way, because it's moving and it's dynamic. But it's not like your parents can't have some sort of serious effect on you that you then carry with you into your other relationships, right? Like if you get abused by your parents in some serious way and it's not um whatever dealt with or approached, um then then you might take that around with you and act that out in your other relationships. Um, but it's not, it's not a transcendental fact that your parents are going to traumatize you in such a way. But whenever that does happen, I think, this I think it's a disservice to say you can just deny the effect of your parents and then move on with it. You get all these habits and memories from your relationship with your primary caregivers, or just the relationships that you've had spent the most time with. Um, but a lot of this stops, if not at 11 years of age, then like maybe 18 or 25 or 30 or whenever you move out of your parents' house. And then you can develop other habits and memories with other serious relationships that may work out really well or may not work out so well, and then you carry the failures of those relationships on with you into other relationships. But at the same time, all of this does get informed by the macro system, and the economic order for sure. And a comment I made a while back is that um, I don't think the nuclear family is so much a problem in the so-called West as there is no safety net. Um, there is no general safety net besides your parents. So if you don't have parents, you're fucked. And if one of your parents, um, if they're just unable to care for you in any sort of legitimate way, you only have one more leg to stand on, and then that's not stable. And then if that fails, then you're fucked again. So I don't know if parents are the main problem, because I don't think that this incest thing is guaranteed in the nuclear family. I think the problem is this social issue that we don't have a safety net besides your parents.
So to me, they operate back and forth. They're a thing that naturally insists on each other. Oedipus, by nature, insists on a nuclear family structure. Like it is something that presumes that you're in a nuclear family, and by nuclear family, the term exists as not because it came about during the nuclear age, but because it was considered to be the nucleus. This idea that this was the center point of a child's life, the child being the nucleus, the parents being the sort of surrounding immediately pieces. So to me, the way that it sort of operates is, a lot like a lot of things, it's a structure that produces itself. And I don't really know where it started. That's the fun part. They have an argument and I can debate it. But you have the idea of Oedipus, which is I have relationship, I exist only triangulated with mommy, daddy, me. Well, that presumes that those are the only major parts of my relationships. And lo and behold, in a nuclear family, it's pretty fucking accurate. Everyone's either mommy, daddy, or an extended version of that in some way. I have an uncle through my father. I have a grandfather who's just a patrilineal lineage, or grandmother, that presupposes that these are also how I see everything. Because it's like my kid's 3. The last year, he's been stuck inside because of COVID, because we all have. Like every kid who's alive right now, their entire relationship with the world is through mommy, daddy. And that's not that like I'm trying to like Oedipalize my kid, but like, you know, he gives me a hug and he's like, you're my best friend. And that shit makes me happy and cry at the same time, because it's like, this is how he sees everything. It's just the nature of it. The difference over time is when we start saying, well, if we break one of this, like the Oedipalization, it will actually do damage to the nuclear family, because they insist upon each other. One is like the physical recurrent structure and familial alliance, the familial structure that allows for Oedipus, but Oedipus is also the way that I biunivocalize everything through mommy, daddy, and therefore the nuclear family is the safest place for me. And it's this really fascinating thing that happens, especially one of the lines here, the question of which comes first. Should we go from the child to the adult or the adult to the child? The idea to me is outright laughable that a child is born Oedipalizing the family. And that is absolutely the position of a lot of people inside of this space, that the child's birth marks the moment of Oedipalization for the father. That the kid does it to the dad by existing is hilarious to me as a thing. Like it's this absurd, it just feels so patently absurd. But this is very much what they're talking about, this idea of, look, this microcosm as it exists, this structure, and Oedipus as a definition of those representations, they click, and they click really fucking well.
They do, but even then I want to say that what the function of mom and dad, or what mom and dad are completely contingent. And yeah, maybe you get a mean and a median, but there's variance and there's tail end things. So I don't think that the nuclear family is always coextensive with Oedipus. Sure, it enables it to a serious degree, and probably wouldn't exist without it.
I can agree with that. I don't think it's necessarily like wholly determinate and required for Oedipus or vice versa, but the nature of like, if we lived in a society where all of our children were taken away from us at birth and raised in giant, massive orphanages, would Oedipus exist in the same way if no one had ever heard of a nuclear family? It's like,
You'd have to say all hierarchies are Oedipal, and I don't know if you can necessarily. I think that'd be a stretch. You'd have to use some imagination.
Yeah,
surely hierarchies would develop. But.
Well, yeah, yes, but even then, you're talking about extremely complex, coextensive social hierarchies inside of an orphanage. You have dozens of nurses, doctors, teachers, gym coaches, administrators. Like, granted, it's a weird, nightmarish dystopia. I'm not saying I want this place, but like just as a variance, that's not something like the idea of having a biunivocalized, hyper-representative version of anything kind of breaks down at that point. Because the nuclear family forces any child to relate to their mother or their father, or both, or daddy, daddy, or mommy, mommy, whatever. Like, the whole point is that there's 2, there's not 6, there's not 14. You biunivocalize and you see everything as one or the other. And this is kind of the nature of just moving on. Like how I realize things, who I connect with. My first teacher becomes the one I understand for all of them after that. The way representation grows for a child and a person. And the nuclear family kind of reinforces Oedipus, and Oedipus reinforces it back. It's this amazing back and forth. At least, again, that's just how I read it, but it's like, sorry to ramble a little bit.
No, I'm not disagreeing with your reading at all. Just adding on. Sorry. Someone keeps wanting to speak and I keep cutting them off.
So he uses the term extra familiar. That means that referring to the socius. Is that how you know that they?
No.
That
No. That extrafamilial means just literally that outside the family.
Yeah. Right,
alliances.
So right. Okay. Outside that nuclear family.
Yeah.
So I interpret it to mean that he's talking about where the institutionalization of the libido, begins, and I get the I think my interpretation is that it begins with the parents who are already part of the socius, and then they lay the foundation for the institutionalize the child, and that's where it begins.
Yeah, the first institution we all have is, well, I mean, all of us who have a family, every parent, and I can tell you this, every parent who doesn't completely suck, you want your child to be successful and happy. And so what does that mean to you, and how do you set that up? It doesn't mean you let your kid, do whatever they want around the house, shit on the floor, pee wherever. Like you need to make them a person. And like, that's not a fun line to find. I will tell you, it's not a fun line. And a lot of people don't give it a second thought. They beat their son until he obeys and does what he wants. They tell their daughter, stand up straight. Don't waste your time reading those books. You need to find a man to take care of you. They tell their son, you're saying what? You're trans? No, that's not how you will be successful and happy, and I won't allow that. This is how we ingratiate and create people, and it's the first institution. The first thing we do is we ruin our children. It's the first thing we all do.
Right.
And I'm saying that as someone who I think being a dad is pretty amazing, but I would still say, like, it's really heartbreaking, and you fuck up in ways you don't realize, and you hear it later and you're like, oh, I fucked up. Shouldn't have said, don't do a thing, because now he won't come in the kitchen, because I didn't want him getting splashed with oil. You can't come in the kitchen. Now he doesn't think he can come in the kitchen ever. So that's like a whole new thing. And it's like, we naturally create the repression. We create these things. I am the daddy, my wife's the mommy, and we do this. And it's just, it's the only way it works. Yeah.
So you have no choice but to be the imperative law of the language of the father.
It's not easy not to be. Parenting through Deleuze, I will tell you, is it would be a worthwhile like talk to have with anyone else who has kids who's done any level of reading on this, because like you will say and do things that your parents, and you don't even realize the stupid shit like finish your food before you get up, you have to eat all your meal. Why would I ever say that to anyone ever? But it's because I just got used to it when I was little. I don't even care about that or remember it, but it's a thing that pops up. Like these early things, this early shit comes up, and you are molding a person. And that's absolutely what you're doing without thinking about it. And it's a very strange world to be in. But it's the idea, the primary institution here. But it ends with, and it's the line I want just to reread again, all the conditions would then be given for an adequate extrafamilial understanding of the labial. But more often, it is solely a question of the familial organization in itself, which is thought to be lived first by the child as a microcosm, then projected into the adult and social development. From this point of view, The discussion can only go round in circles between the holders of cultural and the holders of symbolic or structural in the same organization. It's once you're doing that and you're having that chat, it's just reversing. It's like, oh, well, no, it's the parents who do it to the child. Well, no, I mean, it's the child who do it to the parents. And you can make good arguments both ways. They both feel kind of broken in their own ways for what they are, but then saying like that it's purely structural, the kid came in with it. If it's structural, the kid was born with it. Maybe it's Maybelline. I don't know. Let's read the next paragraph and then we'll close up. And this is a long one. It's going to continue on to the next one. A second postulate common to the culturalists and the symbolists should be added. They all agree that in our patriarchal and capitalist society at least, Oedipus is a sure thing, even if they underline, as does Fromm, the elements of a new matriarchy. They all agree that our society is the stronghold of Oedipus, the starting point for re-encountering an Oedipal structure everywhere. Or, on the contrary, they hold that the terms and the relations should be made to vary within non-Oedipal complexes that are no less familial on that account. That is why our preceding criticism was directed at Oedipus, as it is meant to command our respect and to function for us. It is not at the weakest point, the primitives, that Oedipus must be attacked, but the strongest point, the level of the strongest link, by revealing the degree of disfiguration it implies and brings to bear on desiring production, on the syntheses of the unconscious, and on libidinal investments in our cultural and social milieu. Not that Oedipus counts for nothing in our society. We have said repeatedly that Oedipus is demanded and demanded again and again, and even an attempt as profound as Lacan's at shaking loose from the yoke of Oedipus has been interpreted as an unhoped-for means of making it heavier still, and of securing it on the baby and the schizo. To be sure, it is not only legitimate, but indispensable that the ethnological or historical explanation not be in contradiction with our social organization, or that this organization contains, in its own way, the basic elements of an ethnological hypothesis. This is what Marx was saying when as he recalled the requirements of a universal history. But, as he went on to say, provided that the current organization be capable of conducting its own criticism. And yet, Oedipus's autocritique is something rarely seen in our organization, of which psychoanalysis forms a part. In certain respects, it is correct to question all social formation starting from Oedipus, but not because Oedipus might be a truth of the unconscious that is especially visible where we are concerned. On the contrary, because it is a mystification of the unconscious that has only succeeded with us by assembling the parts and wheels of its apparatus from elements of the previous social formations. It is universal in that sense. Thus, it is indeed within capitalist society that the critique of Oedipus must always resume its point of departure and find again its point of arrival. Okay. This is finally them pointing out and saying the term universal history. Here we are, fellas, let's do this. We're diving in. And they're giving their talk about universal history. It's a different version. It's one I really have come to really love. This idea that there isn't a single line that goes through, but instead we need to talk through that Oedipus, as we know it now, it's not that it always existed as a single constant line or representation through all things. Instead, we should have a conversation around, wait, there are pieces of how these things work. What are the elements? If we break apart all the pieces of Oedipus, all these different things, what then are the pieces that existed in each of these previous socii? And within them, how did they function? And as one socius led to another and to another, what are the parts that got picked up along the way? They use the term assembling parts and wheels of its apparatus from elements of the previous social formation. And I love this idea of taking the previous things and not saying, oh, Oedipus has always been there, but, parts have. Let's say, hey, there was you didn't fuck your mom. That's absolutely true. It was forbidden. But it's not the same thing as Oedipus. Not the mommy, daddy, me, which is a very particular way of looking at stuff. We need to take all these pieces, break them down, and see where they really came from. And when they were picked up, and maybe were they sitting there and waiting underneath all of it during another socius, waiting for the right pieces to pick it up as it got going, which is the really fun side of this. The partial objects. Yes, Tiernan. It's what all are, if we take away the assumption or the large scale representation, we break it down. What partial objects were there? What wheels, what spokes, what gears, what motor? And when was it built? Was it sitting around? Like, that idea is incredibly powerful to me. And that is, as they will continue in the rest of chapter 3, from here, this is them talking through, as they have been so far, but this is them being very explicit. What are the wheels, the spokes, the parts, the engine, all of the things? We're talking about the elements, not Oedipus. They're not saying Oedipus didn't always have parts. They're not saying people didn't not want to fuck their moms. They're not saying Oedipus came out of nowhere and Freud invented it. It's like, no, these things are universal, but it's universal in that sense, specifically. The elements of previous social formations, that some got dropped, some got picked up, others got picked up a second time. And within our current society, we must resume its point of departure and find its point of arrival. Because we have to start with, what is it now? What do we know it as? How do we break it down? And also, we know it got here, so let's talk about its genealogy. It's an amazing way to think through it, and I adore it. So there you go. Any questions or comments before I close out and I make a note that we are going to be continuing this section next week?
Yeah, just one quick question on this whole Marx thing and the critique that it's sort of within the system. It needs to be critiqued within the system. Is it similar to the accelerationist idea of capitalism leading to its own demise, or at least, but also the critique on that of capital, re-territorializing the forces that move against it? Is it, or is this, or do they mean this in a different way? Because I'm making the connection, but I don't know if that's correct in this case.
I think I will tell you really quick. I think you're not the only person to make that connection. It's not one I necessarily agree with, but I think it's a connection that I don't think is wrong. Like, we're talking about the autocritique of a system, of any system, and the ability for it to be capable of conducting its own criticism. It's a requirement of universal history, for sure.
Right, and also the problems that you encounter when a system is able to neuter any critique in a way. I mean, I feel like they're maybe gonna get. I feel like they're setting that up right now. That this autocritique doesn't really change anything, or is it not? This is not the setup for that.
I'm gonna say keep that in mind. I'll say keep that in mind, because I don't want to give you an answer, because I want to see if you still think that after the next few chapters.
Okay.
And if that's mutated at all, because again, none of this is, and all the things you're asking, there's not a correct answer to this. You're asking the right questions where it's like, this is the stuff we need to be talking about and the discussion we need to be having. Like, that's the fucking whole point, is these questions. Spot on. So I wouldn't necessarily say like, oh, this is wrong. No, you're stay away from that side of things. No, bad, Misha, bad. No, like no, these are the right questions. This is the stuff where it's like, look, I don't have an answer to that. They are going to continue to talk about these things and expand on them. I can guarantee you that.
Yeah.
So
no, cool. But then it's good that I have the right intuition in some sense of what they're getting at here. Oh, my bread is done. I need to go to the oven. Okay.
You go to your bread and you do your bread, and I'm gonna go ahead and close out with everything. Unless there's Rimka, JK, any last notes, questions, things before we close out at 2:00?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that he's doing a universalist history based on Marx and Maynard Keynes, the economist. It talks about the flows of desire and so forth, and but he's adding a dimension of a psychoanalysis, the Oedipus complex, to that, and kind of like supporting the Marx's notion of the capitalism and so forth, and but he's also including Keynes, this idea of the flows of monetary exchange.
Very much. Well, and one of the great tragedies, honestly, is he was apparently working on his book on Marx. Like, genuinely, that's makes me sad every time I think about, like, that's the book that we didn't get. Because it would have been amazing. He's pulling from a lot of those, and I'll say he's also pulling in, because as he gets into the psychoanalysis and the philosophical semiotic side of things, and you can go look at logic of sense and difference and repetition, he pulls in a great deal from Kant. He pulls in a great deal from Saussure. He pulls in from Yomslev, from Spinoza, a lot of other sort of elements that also inform this sort of larger scale thinking. We just happened to yesterday in our Logic of Sense reading go over the chapter where he introduces the body without organs and talks through it. And it's as a purely semiotic thing, not as a political or psychoanalytic, as a semiotic element. And it's really incredible to be able to see kind of this sort of setup. But yeah, he's combining a whole bunch of those, a bunch of things. It's I made the joke once that Deleuze is like the Family Guy of philosophy, because like everything's a reference to something. And it works. I really like it. In this case, I'm not a fan of Family Guy, but I like this.
Yeah. The only question is, I wonder if the idea of the Oedipal, complex really can be universalized, where, with this global capitalism, in different cultures, if that's really necessary, that that you could leave out the Oedipal complex part and still understand how the cultures become capitalized, and also explain the processes of flow and monetary exchange and so forth, and without the Oedipal part.
And I think specific. So my understanding of this, just to dive, because that's a really fun tangent to go down. So I'm going to just dive after you. To me, I think a lot of Anti-Oedipus is not actually about Oedipus. Like, it obviously is, but it's more about how Oedipus works as an apparatus or as a assemblage, and them utilizing that as an example and a way to poke at stuff to describe, hey, look, this is Oedipus. Look at Oedipus over time. Look at how this operates. Look at how this goes. Now, apply that to all of the assumptions and assemblages that actually make you up and make us up as societies, where it's not that there is a such thing as an Oedipus complex. These are contingent realizations and assemblages that utilize representation to create and cause repression and cause us to do the things that we're doing and modify behavior and allow people ultimately to go back to what I think is the ultimate question of capitalism and schizophrenia here, which is, why do people desire their own repression? What answering Reich for the first time, and I think they nail that pretty heavily, especially in the next little bit here. But it's like using Oedipus as that element where we can say, look, it's not just this, it's what is beauty? How does this operate? How does this repression, this demand, this complex? And you can start spreading across capital and going, because it's the king of representation, kind of like it really powers through a whole bunch of stuff. Real quick on YouTube, Mindfuck asks, Mindfuck, nice. Are there manuscripts from the Marx book he was planning? Not that I've ever heard of, and I have annoyed, I'm fortunate that we have almost 3,000 people who've come through, and no one's ever shown up that has heard anything about them. And I've Googled, sadly, no. I think it's lost forever. I think there was one thing that sort of leaked out, but I'm uncertain if it's dubious or not. Sorry about that. Go ahead, JK.
Oh, it's all that. That's I guess that that's a clarification. Maybe the Oedipus part doesn't have to be there. It's maybe it's something relevant to Western culture, more, and that maybe other cultures it's a little bit different, or right.
Yeah, and I think it's a similar thing to Laruelle goes on to end up making basically anti-philosophy or non-philosophy or non-Marxism. And I think it's like if you've ever read the Introduction to Non-Marxism, Laruelle does this practice, I think, exemplary, where it's not about Marxism. Like, it totally is about Marxism, but it's about understanding that it gives you these cliches of thought process and representation as you dive into Marxism that themselves actually may not be that helpful, but that you stop realizing the way that you're asking questions is only reconfirming. I go back to the example I gave of I say 3 numbers, 2, 4, 8, and then you say back to me, I'm going to say a series of numbers, and you say them back. I'll say if they apply. People go, oh, well, 4, 8, 16. I'm like, yes. And then they go, cool, it's about doubling. It's like, no, it's not about doubling. That's not my rule. Oh, then 1, 2, 4. It's like, yeah, that matches. Well, it's doubling. No. The answer is, my rule is, the numbers always go up. But you never, ever run into people who, when they play that game, turn around and go 6, 3, 1. Like, no one ever does that. So you'll never find someone who truly, like, invalidates what gives you a no answer. And this is the problem. If you start with a place of Oedipus, or you start with a place of, oh, it's ascending, you don't realize that you're assuming it's ascending. Like, you need to go all the way back to the first assumption. And no one ever does that. And we need to really do more to get to that point. And they're utilizing Oedipus here as an example of that. But it's feel free. It's an amazing game to play with literally anyone, because everyone will always give you ascending numbers. You will never, ever, and if you do, please let me know, because I want to know what happened once. But no one will ever give you descending numbers. And so no one will ever be able to guess what the actual rule is. Humans are weird. We're fucking weird, man. But with that, sorry, go ahead.
Thanks for that. Yeah, thank you. That's thanks. See you next week.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank everyone. Thank you on YouTube for joining us. We hope to see you all next week. Same bat time, same bat place, all of that. And we'll continue this section. Thank you for coming, JK, by the way. Thanks for coming, Ken. This was great.
Thank you.